Ferdinand Marcos was inaugurated to his first term as the 10th President of the Philippines on 30 December 1965. His inauguration marked the beginning of his two-decade-long stay in power, even though the 1935 Philippine Constitution had set a limit of only 2 four-year terms of office. Marcos had won the Philippine presidential election of 1965 against the incumbent president, Diosdado Macapagal. Before Marcos' presidency, the Philippines was the second-largest economy in Asia, behind only Japan. He pursued an aggressive program of infrastructure development funded by foreign loans, making him very popular throughout almost all of his first term and eventually making him the first and only president of the Third Philippine Republic to win a second term, although it would also trigger an inflationary crisis which would lead to social unrest in his second term, and would eventually lead to his declaration of martial law in 1972-1965 election campaign. Ferdinand Marcos was a member of the Liberal Party (LP) in 1965, becoming Senate President during the presidential term of fellow Liberal Macapagal. Marcos found his ambitions to run for president blocked when Macapagal decided to run for a second term, so Marcos jumped from the LP to the Nacionalista Party (NP), eventually becoming the NP's candidate for president. An acknowledged master of populist imagery, Marcos projected a persona of youth and virility, having himself photographed by rice farmers in their fields. He also cast himself as a war hero, claiming to be the most decorated war hero of the Philippines on the strength of 27 supposed war medals and decorations which were later revealed to be mostly propaganda, being inaccurate or untrue. Marcos won the election with 51.94% of the vote, Macapagal having garnered 42.88%, while Raul Manglapus of the Party for Philippine Progress got 5.17%. About 0.01% of the votes went to 9 other candidates who ran for the post under various independent parties' administration. First inauguration of Ferdinand Marcos. Upon winning the election, Marcos appointed a cabinet composed mostly of technocrats and intellectuals, most notably Executive Secretary Rafael Salas, Education Secretary Onofre Corpuz, Finance Secretary Cesar Virata, and National Economic and Development Authority Director General Gerardo Sicat. Agricultural and rural development projects, in an effort to strengthen the influence of the office of the president and simultaneously weaken the strong patronage bonds which rural Filipinos had with their local leaders. Marcos created the Presidential Arm on Community Development (PACD), which would initiate development projects at the barrio level without going through the barrio and municipal governments. Marcos also took credit for the dramatic increase in rice production caused by the 1968 introduction of a new miracle rice variety, IR8, by the International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños, Laguna, although the IRI program that developed the variety had started as early as 1962, during the Macapagal administration, and was the product of an international consortium, not the Philippine government. Formation of industrial monopolies in the Philippines 1965 to 1986, and cronies of Ferdinand Marcos. During this first term, Marcos also began systematically cultivating a group entrepreneurs and industrialists loyal to him, rather than the Philippines' ruling class of landowners, making these cronies richer and more powerful through what would later be called behest loans, which funneled foreign assistance and soft loans to their businesses on the pretense of spurring industrial development. Expansion of the Philippine military. One of Marcos' earliest initiatives upon becoming president was to significantly expand the Philippine military. In an unprecedented move, Marcos chose to concurrently serve as his own defense secretary, allowing him to have a direct hand in running the military. He also significantly increased the budget of the armed forces, tapping them in civil projects such as the construction of schools. Generals loyal to Marcos were allowed to stay in their positions past their retirement age, or were rewarded with civilian government posts, leading Senator Benigno S. Aquino Jr. to accuse Marcos in 1968 of trying to establish a garrison state. Sending troops to the Vietnam War. Under intense pressure from the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson, Marcos reversed his pre-presidency position of not sending Philippine forces to Vietnam War, and consented to a limited involvement, asking Congress to approve sending a combat engineer unit. Despite opposition to the new plan, the Marcos government gained congressional approval and Philippine troops were sent from the middle of 1966 as the Philippine Civic Action Group (PHILCAG). PHILCAG reached a strength of some 1,600 troops in 1968 and between 1966 and 1970 over 10,000 Filipino soldiers served in South Vietnam, mainly being involved in civilian infrastructure projects, loans for infrastructure development, with an eye towards becoming the first president of the Third Republic to be re-elected to a second term. The Marcos administration began taking up massive foreign loans to fund rice, roads, and school buildings, the linchpin slogan of his re-election campaign. The Omnibus Tax Law of 1969 was passed too late by Congress to be useful to Marcos' publicity efforts, and at any rate, did not succeed in raising significant new funds. So it was foreign loans that funded the 70% increase in infrastructure spending from 1966 to 1970, compared to the Macapagal administration's spending from 1961 to 1965, which included the North Luzon Expressway and the Maharlika Highway, and the construction of 58,745 pre-fabricated and 38,705 regular school buildings. The first Marcos administration's budget deficit was thus 72% higher than the Philippine government's annual deficit from 1961 to 1965. This began a pattern of loan-funded spending which the Marcos administration would continue until the Marcoses were deposed in 1986, resulting in economic instability still being felt today, and of debts that experts say the Philippines will have to keep paying well into 2025. The grandest infrastructure projects of Marcos' first term, especially the Cultural Center of the Philippines complex, also marked the beginning of what critics would call Ferdinand Marcos and First Lady Imelda Marcos edifice complex, with grand public infrastructures projects prioritized for public funding because of their propaganda value. Re-election campaign, 1969, Ferdinand Marcos presidential campaign, 1969. When the time came for the Philippine presidential election of 1969, it was taken for granted that Ferdinand Marcos and Fernando Lopez would be unanimously nominated as the respective presidential and vice presidential candidates of the Nacionalista Party. Nevertheless, the party's ruling junta met in Makati a week earlier before the July 1969 Nacionalista Party National Convention at the Manila Pavilion, in order to assure that the nomination would be unanimous. The duo went against the Liberal Party's candidates, Sergio Osmeña Jr. and Genaro Magsaysay. With his popularity already beefed up by debt-funded spending, Marcos' popularity made it very likely that he would win the election, but he decided, as national artist for literature Nick Joaquin reported in the Philippines Free Press, leave nothing to chance. Time and Newsweek would eventually call the 1969 election the dirtiest, most violent and most corrupt in Philippine modern history, with the term 3 gigaseconds, meaning guns, goons, and gold, coined to describe administration's election tactics of vote buying, terrorism and ballot snatching. Marcos used the military and the government bureaucracy for his campaign, and also went on a campaign spending spree, initiating $50 million worth in infrastructure projects meant to impress the electorate. The most infamous incidents of violence took place in Batanes, where Philippine constabulary officers, paramilitary groups and hired guns essentially took over the island, and motorcycle-riding thugs rode around terrorizing voters and COMELEC officials, and beating up opposition leaders. Rapid campaign spending was so massive that it would be responsible for the balance of payments crisis of 1970. Marcos was reported to have spent PHP 100 for every PHP 1 that Osmeña spent, using up PHP 24 million in Cebu alone. By the following year, however, the government would be unable to pay its debts, and would decide to enter into a debt rescheduling arrangement plan with the International Monetary Fund. The stabilization plan involved in the agreement included numerous macroeconomic interventions, such as significantly devaluating the Philippine peso. However, the inflationary effect these interventions had on the local economy brought about the social unrest which motivated the proclamation of martial law in 1972. The 1969 elections were held on the 11th of November, and Marcos won an unprecedented second full term as President of the Philippines. His running mate, incumbent Vice President Fernando Lopez, was also elected to a third full term as Vice President of the Philippines.